prior. Anyone who has suffered deep grief will recognize these questions and perhaps even the responses.
Is anyone out there?
Yup,
I feel so alone.
I know.
I can't believe this happened to me.
I'm sorry.
People
It's
in my
horrible.
life
Just awful.
keep saying to me, buck up and move on. I want to glue their lips to the wall. I know I'm not supposed to feel this way, but I do. Is that okay? I know it has to be hard for people to talk to me, especially if they want me to just hurry up and be myself again. I don't know if I can ever be myself again. I don't know how to process the way I feel. Am I forgivable? I can't stuff my head with guilt anymore. I can't sleep. Is this normal? I just want to be myself again.
I know. You are normal and sane. And the way you're feeling is just the way I felt and still feel sometimes. By seeking and offering company, we form a cohort. Faced with someone who's terribly upset, almost nobody knows how to be. The best people simply say, I don't know how to be. But they listen, and they try with no agenda other than to listen and try. The most important part is not the being, but the trying. Here ends the reading.
Judah Halevi was a Jewish poet living in Spain about 1,000 years ago. The translation of this beloved poem has been attributed to Chaim Stern around 1930. It's a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, hope, dream, to be and, oh, to lose. A thing for fools this, and a holy thing to love, for your life has lived in me. Your laugh once lifted me. Your word was a gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. It's a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death has touched. Here ends this reading.
We began to talk about it 5 or 6 years ago because it is the fear of every parent of a child addicted to heroin and anyone who loves someone in the grips of substance abuse disorder. Maybe we lay awake in bed nights actively worrying about scenarios, or maybe it's just an unconscious drumbeat of fear that we hardly know is there most days. Jasmine, who has been one of my best friends since we lived across the hall from each other in the Foster Walker dorm at Northwestern University in 1986, has always been someone with whom I can be completely honest, and she with me. She introduced me to a concept of soul grapes. Before we were born, she taught me, and she doesn't remember where she heard it, Certain souls are part of the same cluster in heaven or the great realm of the mystery, like grapes on a bunch together. And at our birth, we are shaken off the stems of our cluster and set loose in the world, tumbling into the human experience in our separate human bodies. And if we are lucky in life, we meet up with some of the grapes from our cluster. And we know each other when we do meet at a profound level, at a soul level. We recognize each other as grapes. Jasmine's one of my grapes. Hi, Grape, I know you might be watching. She said to me those years ago, if I get the phone call that I'm fearing, you're going to be my first phone call, because I'm going to need you. And I said, of course. I said, of course, anything you need ever. And we waited. I waited. She feared. We waited for that shoe, that dreadful shoe, to drop. And on November 13th, Ellis died of a drug overdose. Or if we are to use more accurate language, and I'm learning about this, he died of fentanyl poisoning, part of the epidemic in this country. Ellis had been in and out of rehab several times, and he had been sober for a year. He was 26 years old and in San Diego. He went back to the drug one more time, maybe in his imagination, and this batch contained the lethal fentanyl, and our beautiful young man died. The police are investigating the drug dealers who sold him the poison, but the family, the friends, are left with the work of grief, the work of saying goodbye to someone they loved, the work of making sense, or whatever it is we do, so that we can carry on with life step by step, and sometimes just one breath at a time. I want to talk this morning about the work of continuing to live in the presence of a grief so debilitating it seems that it could literally kill us. I just want to hold a moment to honor such grief we have endured, or might currently be enduring. We don't want it. We don't like it. It's dreadful. It brings us to the brink of an abyss that we would hope and pray in our lives, that our lives would never lead us to, but often does. We honor our grief. Grief changes us. Above all, I think, it rudely and mercilessly tears the veil from ordinariness as a bucket of ice cold water being thrown on us again and again so that we gasp from shock. It says, hey, wake up, good morning, hello, you are not in control. Everything changes. Everything is subject to mortality. Love, thoughts, and prayers can't protect you, and now you know this in a very personal way. This word of truth brings us to our knees, to our beds curled up, our couches, or bent over sobbing. It comes in waves. It can hit at any time, and it doesn't go in a linear, orderly fashion like Kubler-Ross suggested. She was right about grief having stages, but the stages come all over the place, and they go back to the first stage and all of that. Grief isn't cosmic punishment, but one of the first cries of response to suffering that we may make is, why me? Why my loved one? Why my health and body? Why my town obliterated by flood or fire? Why me? This is a cri de coeur, a cry of the heart that comes from shock that something we probably only previously had heard about and fervently hoped would not happen to us has now visited our lives. That's a natural cry. And there are no satisfactory answers, only the reality that this is how life seems to be. The evidence is long in by now. Why anyone? because that's life. We have no idea, and religious doctrines have been concocted in large part to provide not just explanations, but to construct elaborate and sometimes ridiculous rituals that are meant to stave off disaster and suffering from communities and individuals. When these rituals don't work, the tendency has been to blame the gods or to try something else to appease the gods. Or it has been to blame the individual who is suffering, to stigmatize them, to isolate them. This response to grief this response to the grief that befalls all of us is totally irrational. But watch how often it still operates even among educated and sophisticated people. Just pay attention to that. We sometimes act as though grief is contagious. Have you noticed that? If you've been somebody who's experienced something that caused tremendous grief, sometimes there's that I don't want to get, it's not rational, but I kind of don't want to get near them because I might catch it. Grief is terrible. Suffering is horrible. No one wants it, and we can't be blamed for panicking and thinking things like, if I did this or that, I know this wouldn't happen to me. If I take this vitamin and think this right thought, this won't happen to me. If I touch this holy relic or light this candle, I will be spared this. And there the one changed by grief sits, singed in the fire of loss and shock, burnt and crispy at the edges, maybe smoldering a little bit. And the panicked community, stiff with fear that the misfortune may somehow be catching, says things like, he's in a better place. Or, everything happens for a reason. You know what that is? That's just someone's panicked way of saying, I'm sorry, I cannot abide with you in the terrible truth of our ultimate vulnerability, and I just can't do it, so I'm going to say this thing instead. I'm going to toss this out. You know, everything does happen for a reason. The reason is that we're alive, and things happening is part of being alive's basic definition. And I really don't mean to be flippant, I don't. But beyond that, no one can ever know for sure. Part of how we keep each other company in life is that we wonder together, what does it all mean? Jasmine sent me a Ram Dass quote yesterday, and it says, we are all just walking each other home. Silent companionship is fine. Just showing up is really good and adequate. Sending casseroles, so much better than cliches that don't hold up to any kind of actual theological or rational scrutiny, and that actually don't help, except they help us get out of the room faster sometimes. As grief that changes us, or as grief changes us, we do have some internal choices that we may not recognize immediately as we are being transformed by suffering, as we are becoming a person who knows much more deeply how fragile existence is. We stand not just at the abyss of dreadful existential awareness, we also stand at an emotional crossroads. Will this experience, this painful awakening, cause us to constrict, or will it cause us maybe to open a little bit more? Will we shut down, or will we remain trusting to life, and of love? Because as John just read, it is a fearful thing to love what death can touch. It takes time to know. It takes time to even become aware that we have any agency and choice at all in the matter. At Ellis's memorial service, I began by saying that there are two key questions before the morning gathered community. What do we do with our grief? And what do we do with our love? One of the things that we do with our grief is what the people at the memorial service were already doing. We gather so that we can share the loss. We share stories and memories, play music that expresses love and sorrow. One of the most beautiful tributes at Ellis's memorial was a friend who played the saxophone and didn't say a word. He said everything through the music, everything. And we listened to a recording of Ellis himself playing his own music. Now, this seems like a given and obvious thing that friends and families and community members should come together when something shattering happens. We know this is good and right, but the pandemic experience of being deprived of such gatherings has instructed us much more deeply of the necessity of gathering and its importance. Grief changes us by driving us in a Jeep over a very rocky and unpaved terrain, and then it tosses us out at the edge of a crumbling cliff. Here, enjoy the view. And we say, what the hell, grief? Which is behind the wheel of the Jeep, scrolling on its phone or clipping its fingernails or having a cup of coffee. It isn't trying to be mean. It will point its finger over to a beautiful flower growing on the edge of that cliff and say, well, look, that's pretty, right? If I hadn't brought you here, you never would have seen that. Or the eagle circling in the heavens up there. Look how much you're noticing. You should thank me. No, thanks, no. That is not how we've signed up, any of us, to become more sensitive and attentive to life's beauties. But that is, in fact, how grief often changes us. You who have had the veil of complacency and comfort ripped away, you know. The emotions are raw, your senses vibrate with weird acuity, or maybe go dormant for a while, as our body's protective shock response wraps our brains and senses in a kind of cotton batting. The consequences of this experience is often that you become aware of yourself after a while as a member of a secret society of the especially compassionate. And what do we do with the love? I said at Ellis's funeral, the other question is, what do I do with this love? And I said, you give it. You gather it in and let it comfort you and keep you together. And then when you're ready, as you're ready, you take that love that has given you its inextinguishable power and strength, and you use it to bring Ellis with you on the journey of the rest of your life. And that's what we do. We bring them with us. We go on. And we keep changing, molded like clay by all of it. As Kate Inglis wisely observes in her field guide to grief, none of us is entitled to an uneventful life. The challenge is to stay pliable and warm enough together so that the shaping in the hands of life is bearable and begins eventually to even feel like a creative process. If we harden, we break off and crumble in those shaping hands of life. One breath at a time. One breath at a time. I don't know about everything happens for a reason. Everything happens. And we have each other as it does. Thanks be to God.